Recognize that all children grieve. Even if it doesn't look like they're grieving, they are.
One of the stories I heard about was the two little children whose mother had died, and they were in this age grouping, and they kept running up to the coffin and kissing their mother, and then running back and sitting down and looking. Remember the story of Snow White? That's what they were remembering.
Well, the one thing with my daughter is that right now we're going through that she's afraid that I'm going to leave and I'm not going to come home one day like my husband did. And you know, it's, Mommy, when are you coming back, and how long are you going to be gone, and wanting to sleep with me. And sometimes it's difficult because I don't want her to get so dependent on me, but I understand that she's small and that she loves her mommy.
And she looked up and kind of started to cry, and she said, I can't remember what Daddy looks like.
At first, when it first happened, it didn't really hit me. You know, it was like I was okay. And then as we went, people started to come to visit my mother. And it's like they would be, you know, being 13, seeing them laughing and talking about old times, I was like, how can they laugh, you know, at a time like this? That's how I felt at that time.
Welcome to Grief Share for Kids. I'm your host, Linda Ranson Jacobs. If you have the responsibility for caring for a child who has lost a loved one, my heart goes out to you. Grieving children are hard to figure out. 1 minute they're crying, and 5 minutes later, they're playing. Every day, you re-answer painful questions like, where's Daddy? Where's Mommy? Or, are you going to die too? If your child is grieving, you probably are too. If your child's parent died, you probably lost your spouse. If a sibling died, then you've probably lost a child. That's why helping children through grief is so very difficult. Grief is debilitating, and you may not have the energy to help your child. If that's your situation, hopefully this video will help. Because if grief has drained you of the ability to help your child, you can share this video with someone who can help. And if you do have the strength to guide your child along the journey of grief, this video will help you take the first steps down that path. Welcome to Grief Share for Kids. One of the first things you need to know about caring for a grieving child is this: children grieve differently from adults.
They go in and out of their grief, back and forth, back and forth. 1 minute they're talking about grandfather who died, and they're sad. And the next minute, can you come outside and play baseball with me?
God gave children the ability to break up the pain with things like play and fantasy. They have to. They don't have all the developmental components they need to handle big chunks of grief like an adult would.
Also at this time for them, death isn't permanent. You know, they can come back again. And some of the different stories that they've heard, Jesus was raised from the dead. E.T. Came back again. Wile E. Coyote always gets resurrected after he gets smashed in the cartoons.
Added to that is their developmental cognitive abilities that until children are between the ages of 8 and 12, they don't really recognize that death is inevitable, that it's universal, that it's a final thing, and that it's a biological process. And so until they're able to conceptualize that, as well as reasoning as adolescents that there's a loss of hopes and dreams with that person, they really don't have the full sphere of how they can understand death and grief.
So you can't have adult expectations for little children because they might make jokes. One of the things about the children is that they will ask the same question again and again and again, and really try your patience at this time. And you wonder, I've said it, why don't they get it? It just doesn't connect because they don't have the same thinking apparatus as we do.
Let's look at the kinds of behavior you can expect from children at different developmental stages. As we do this, you'll notice there are some overlap in the ages we'll discuss. That's because children develop differently. We're simply sharing a guide as to what may be happening in your child's life. We'll begin with children ages 2 to approximately 5 years of age.
Well, a toddler senses something is wrong. He'll sense the upset of the parents. And maybe the toddler isn't getting the attention that he normally gets. And a toddler can feel the stress. He can be more irritable, regress a little more, but they can't really talk about it.
They're not going to be expressive and say, I have a tummy ache, like you would with a 5 or 7-year-old. But they're going to have that searching behavior, as we said. They're going to be maybe extra whiny, clingy. You might see behaviors like that. Of course, regressions. If they're potty trained, they may revert back to not being potty trained. They may even have bowel problems. They may have eating disorders, as far as their appetite might decrease. Sleep problems, you'll see that with toddlers.
Here's something else you should know. Toddlers do not see death as a permanent state. This is evidenced by the way they talk about their deceased loved one.
So they may say, Daddy's dead, but then you'll hear them telling a friend in the other room, I saw my daddy, he was sleeping. And that's how they cope. And what a parent would do with that is to just go back to that and explore that with the child, say at a nice private time at bedtime or in a quiet place or in their private times together, so that they can reinforce that daddy is dead. And with children, teens, adults, and you need to use the D word. You need to say, Daddy died. We can't move the child to believe that it's irreversible because that's their age development level. But we can reinforce the death by just using those concrete terms.
Children ages 3 to 7 will respond to their grief in a variety of ways. One response, which H. Norman Wright calls magical thinking, has to do with the way they process what has happened to their loved one.
I was sick, and I touched my grandfather, and my grandfather died. Therefore, I caused Granddad's death. They think in that way. Their conclusions are not the conclusions that we come to.
Children between the ages of about 6 to 9 personify death. They think of it as a person or even a monster. Children this age are also by nature very curious. Expect them to ask more questions about why their loved one died and about the causes of death in general. And even though some children this age group will begin accepting the finality of death, it doesn't mean they're processing it like an adult would. So expect them to make awkward statements and ask embarrassing questions.
They're grasping now that this is going to be different. They will ask maybe embarrassing questions. A child at this age might make statements that are bothersome, such as, well, I miss my sister. She's gone now because she died, but this will mean Mommy and Daddy will have more time for me. Now, they don't see any problem with that type of reasoning, and they're beginning to reason at this point. And something like that, could be upsetting to the parents because they think, well, they don't have the compassion for their sister. They don't miss their sister in the same way as we do, and they won't.
At some point, a grieving child will probably ask you when you will die. On the surface, this seems like an insensitive question, but remember, having already lost a loved one, this question stems from a child's desire for security. A truthful, reassuring answer is the best way to respond.
First of all, I think that you need to have guardianship set up. And then you communicate that to the children if they're bringing it up. If they're not bringing it up, you don't have to plant that seed in their mind. But to let them know, should anything ever happen to me, then these people will take care of you, because the main thing they're worried about is what's going to happen to them. And you don't address the emotional loss that they'll go through, because you can't really address that ahead of time anyway, but that their needs and their care will be provided for. That, though it may be disturbing, is much less disturbing than telling them that nothing will happen to you when they know that that might not be true.
For children of all ages, it's common for them to worry that those they care for will die soon.
Children who lose a sibling may feel very insecure about their own lives. Certainly if they're younger than the child who died, they may feel like when they're that same age, they could be in danger.
Children commonly grieve in what I like to call saga: sadness, anger, anxiety, and guilt. When a child has anger, some parents are uncomfortable with this because the child has not been an angry, spirited child. They've been pretty mild-mannered. Now the child is a grieving child, and he is mad because his precious older brother, who was everything to him, is now taken away. He has to act out some way. So he'll act out in anger.
Depending on how the community is around them and how their parents are doing, they may worry about who's going to take care of me as time goes by. They may worry about the death of somebody else in the family. They may worry about their own future. And as they grow up, they may worry about marrying and having children themselves. It's such a risky business. I have heard some young adults say, I saw what my parents went through and I don't want to go through that. So I'm either going to not marry or not have children. It's very sad.
Children ages 9 to 12 can still engage in magical thinking, and if you notice this in your child, you'll need to reassure the child that these thoughts or behaviors did not cause the loved one to die. And with increased reasoning skills, expect your child to want to talk more about death. If your child begins to act unruly after the death of a loved one, you should not be surprised. It's typical for children to respond this way.
What a parent or the adults around that child might see is a child who's becoming more and more aggressive, more and more anger, or more withdrawn. You might see behavior that child has never displayed before.
Well, when I was a teenager in school, after that my father died, my mother told me that I had gotten into trouble, and she said, you haven't been acting right ever since your father died. And I couldn't make the connection, but she made it.
Although it's common for children to misbehave after the death of a loved one, this does not mean that you should accept or even condone or write off a child's disobedience by saying, oh, he is just grieving. Rather, we must respond the same way that God comforts us when we are afraid and we are suffering.
God's goodness to me is not just a pat on the back. It's also a call to do certain things. The best example is God responds to me in grief like a father. A father's going to come to you. If you're struggling as a child, he's going to come to you, he's going to encourage you, and then he's going to say, but this is what you better be doing. He's not just going to say, this is what you better be doing. If I'm a dad of a 2-year-old and it's nighttime, we're all in bed, and I hear my child screaming in the dark, I'm not going to go in the dark and lecture him. Because I know even though he may not understand all that's going on, the fear he's experiencing is real. My instinctive first response is to wrap arms of love around him, to comfort him. Then I'm going to say, now you notice when I turn on the lights, those things that you thought were monster spiders on the wall were actually the moon showing through the trees onto your wall. And when I turn on the lights, they disappear. So I've given hope, I've given correction. Now Daddy's going to say this to you. Daddy wants you to go to sleep. And Daddy doesn't want you to get out of bed because you need to sleep and Daddy needs to sleep. And Daddy's down the hall for you and Daddy will see you in the morning. But you know now you don't have any reason to be afraid. That's exactly what God does to me. He gives me hope, starts to correct my thinking, but He gives me things to do. And I actually need all of those.
As you can see, if you're going to model your parenting after God, you need to respond sympathetically and with love to your children when they disobey you. They're going through a very difficult time, and you need to keep this in mind as you deal with them. However, you must respond with correction and the establishment of boundaries. Lois Raby, who helped her daughters grieve the loss of their father, has some advice for us.
They'll say things like, you know, Daddy didn't do it that way, or if Daddy were here, he'd let me do it, or if Mommy were here, she'd let me do it if it's the other way around. And I think that when you've lost, especially if you've lost a spouse and your children are left without that parent, you feel like everything they suffer is related to that. But you have to be aware of the fact that they're also children and they're going through very normal developmental stages, and they're going to go through things that they would have gone through no matter what, and you need to put the structure, the discipline structure back in place. And so, you know, at some point I had to say to my children, you know, Daddy isn't here and I'm here and you have to deal with me, and this is the way it is. I just think consistency is very important. Communicating to them what the rules or boundaries are and what the consequences are if they don't follow through on that is really, really important.
Another thing that may cause concern with parents is hearing their children complain about headaches or tummy aches. The children may also have trouble sleeping, be more restless, or be less energetic than normal. If your child displays these symptoms, don't worry. During the first 6 months of grief, these symptoms are common. But if you do decide to take your child to the doctor, that's okay too. Just be sure to tell your doctor that your child is grieving. As children mature, their ability to grasp abstract concepts grows. As a result, their understanding of their loved one's death will deepen. Also, they will miss their loved one's presence at significant events in life. These factors will cause children to revisit their grief at different stages of their lives.
When my father died, I was a teenager, and each time I had an important event in my life thereafter, the grief would erupt because I wished he had been there, and I still wished he was there.
They hit some of the very important milestones in their life. They graduate from high school, they enter college, they fall in love, they may get married, they may have their first child. All of those become firsts for them that are delayed because those life events had not happened until then, but they are very well aware that mom or dad isn't there. And that's why for them, grief is something that will have to be attended more incrementally as they go along, versus what a surviving spouse may have to do 24/7 because you have lived with that person and you have to face all of those right now.
So each milestone in a child's life quite possibly will cause grief eruptions because of the fact that they're going to miss that person who isn't there to experience that with them.
Since children revisit grief throughout their lives, it's important to prepare them for this. Be sure to tell them they can expect to deal with their grief in fresh ways as they reach significant milestones. You may be wondering, what about teens? How do they respond to grief? The focus of this session is helping children grieve. However, there are a few things that we would like to say about teen grief also. Adolescence is a time of change. Add the death of a loved one to this uncertain time, and you have a difficult situation. This is complicated by the fact that many adults encourage teens to be strong or to fill the voids left by the deceased loved ones. With that advice, teens often don't know where to go with their grief.
They are just so involved in their life that life continues to go on. School's there, peer relationships. As adolescents, there's a lot of peer pressure that they really have to attend to. There's no way for them to escape. And so grieving often gets delayed.
When dealing with grieving teens, it's important to remember that although they may appear to be adults, they're not. They're still developing, and up until their first encounter with death, many teens had a sense of invulnerability. Death unhinges their world. But for a variety of reasons, your teen may not verbalize this, but the signs are everywhere. They include feeling anger, poor performance in school, increased performance in school, depression, isolation, acting as if everything is all right, problems sleeping, and other somatic problems. If your child has turned to drugs or alcohol to cope with grief, you may need to get help from a Christian counselor who is trained in helping grieving teens. If defiant behavior marks your child's grief again, it's important to respond lovingly and sympathetically, but with boundaries. Grief does not change what is right and wrong, and it doesn't give your teen a free pass to do whatever he or she wants. Providing loving correction to your child is consistent with God's method of comfort. Doing otherwise is detrimental to your child's healing. Let's take another look at how teens respond to grief. Notice that some grieving children will improve in school or take on more responsibility around the house. Often when this happens, we think, that child is doing well with his grief. This is not necessarily the case. It may be the child's way of ignoring grief. The child needs to talk about what he or she is going through. Some of the advice we'll give later on in this session on helping and talking to grieving children can be applied to teens. Also, finding a Christian peer support group for your child can help. If you're the parent of grieving children or teenagers, you may be puzzled, even frustrated by their behavior. But assuming that you're providing outlets for them to share their grief with others, and as long as they're not defying you or doing harm to themselves, don't worry. If their behavior or physical problems do not improve after 6 months, consider taking your child to talk to a Christ-centered, biblically based counselor who is trained and has experience working with grieving children. And remember, just because a person is trained does not mean he or she is experienced. Be sure to get references. After learning some of the things that your children are dealing with in grief, you may think you need professional help to meet their needs. And while in some cases that may be necessary, it shouldn't be your first option. If your own grief hasn't sapped you of all your strength, you can reach out to help your children and help them with their grief. And this is important because often, after the death of a sibling or a parent, children feel that their grief is being ignored. This is because their parents are the focal point of most of the comfort of family and friends.
When there is a loss, especially within a family, the focus goes more towards the spouse, maybe the parents, and especially if the children are younger, we forget that they grieve too, but we don't include them. We don't talk about them. We're so busy taking care of the details, say if there's a memorial service or funeral, all the adjustments, and the children get left behind.
If you don't have the strength to reach out to your child, it's okay. Or maybe the lines of communication with your child have never been open, or they've been closed for quite a while. Again, there's no need to panic. There are many people who want to help you and your child. Start by looking within your own family. If you can't find help there, reach out to your grief share group. Someone in your group may be going through their second or even third cycle and may be willing to spend time talking with your child about his or her grief.
And sometimes it takes other people to come alongside and say, okay, let's talk about the rest of the family. What can be done here? Because some children grow up feeling neglected and feeling resentful. As one child said, what would it take for me to die before I get the attention that I need? It's like my brother who's died is getting far more attention now than he ever got when he was living.
This is why the support systems around that family need to come in and support all the members, especially those children, because the parents just don't have what it takes to be there for those children. The loss of that other child has been so devastating.
If you don't have any experience working with grieving children, it's easy to worry that their reactions to loss are unhealthy, when in fact they are normal. For example, Many grieving children may want to wear their lost loved one's old clothes. Why do children do this? Often, the clothes and their scent remind the children of their loved one. Another thing you may notice is that children will regress developmentally. A child may revert to bedwetting or acting like a younger child. If this happens, don't worry. Your child is going back to a time when life seemed more secure and stable. So don't be surprised if your child suddenly wants to sleep with their stuffed animals or begins walking around with a favorite blanket or pillow. In addition to reminding the children of a more secure time, the softness of those items can be comforting to them. Children will also reenact the funeral or the death of their loved one. This is not an example of children making light of what happened. Instead, children learn by playing. By reenacting the death or the funeral, they're coming to terms with it on their level. Helping children share what they are going through is an excellent way to help them work through their grief. H. Norman Wright explains why.
Well, there's 3 reasons why it's important to talk to the children. They have fears, and by talking with them, this will alleviate a lot of their fear. Secondly, it gives them more of a sense of control. They have the feeling that, oh, I can bring anything up. I can talk about this. I can get some answers. And then thirdly, it gives them permission to share their feelings. And that is so important because it's hard for a child to fully comprehend what all the feelings are and why they're there and what they mean. And this way they can express it. Because if they don't talk about it with you or somebody else, the only person they're going to talk about it with is themselves, and they don't have answers. They will give themselves misinformation. They will reinforce that misinformation so it becomes a reality.
Before talking to children about their grief, there are a few things you should know. Often, children are reluctant to share their grief with their parent. One reason is that their parents often get emotional when they talk to their children about grief. The children think they are causing their parent pain.
A parent might, in their own way, try to postpone their own grief. And so the child sees the parent not grieving, and the child's going to take their cue from that parent and postpone their grief.
And I think that it's kind of an intricate dance of, yes, if I don't grieve, the kids aren't eventually going to be helped, because in some ways they, from research, tend to kind of wait for their surviving parent to become stable before they can really go through their own intense grieving in a lot of cases. And so if a parent, a surviving parent, is waiting till their kids are okay, it's going to be kind of a standoff, and neither kids or parent are going to have worked their way through grief.
Before talking to your children, take time to assess their understanding about what has happened. This can help you communicate better with your children.
Find out what they know, find out how they understand that by conversation, and just add to it enough. Don't go into long detail.
Another reason it's important to listen to children is that you can learn about what they have heard from other friends or family members about the loved one's death. You may be surprised at what they've picked up. Often, what they've heard from others can be a source of fears or can be confusing to them. Listening can give you the opportunity to address these things. When talking to your children, you have to be careful to share what is appropriate. Not doing so can lead to serious misunderstandings and fears about death.
You need to give as much information as the child can handle according to their age level. But you've got to be very honest.
You have to be careful with the terms you're using with children. You have to think what that sounds like to a 3 to 7-year-old.
Do you give long, involved sentences, or are they short, factual, to the point, words that the child can grasp?
When we first got back from the hospital after their sister died, we were at a loss for words. And we probably did all the wrong things. They wanted to know how she died. And my husband said, well, she fell asleep. It's just like falling asleep, only she just didn't wake up. It was very comfortable, you know, that type of thing. Neither one of my girls could sleep after that for months because they were afraid they were going to die. You know, their comprehension is so limited.
Truthful death language is using the proper terms. grandfather died. Truthful death language is not using statements like, well, Jesus needed him more than we did, or he's gone on a long journey, he's gone on a trip, he just isn't going to be here anymore. No, grandfather died, and then the next question is going to be, what does death mean? How do you explain death to a little child? Well, death means that grandfather won't be able to do what he used to do. He won't be able to talk, he won't be able to feel, he won't be able to walk, he can't go to the bathroom anymore, he can't eat, grandfather can't drink anything anymore, he doesn't breathe anymore. Putting it in short, simple statements. But this is what death is, and death is permanent. His body is no longer going to be here.
I also did share with the children as much as I could at the levels I felt like they were ready. But I think the one thing is to listen to your children, share with them what you think you can share with them at the time. Sometimes you can share a little bit, and then as they grow older, you can share more with them. You can be more open with them because they're ready to accept it. Because children's minds, they take in a lot more than you think, and they understand. And sometimes they don't understand, but they're thinking about it a lot.
If you don't know the answer to a question that your child asks, tell him or her that you don't know. If you make up something, you run the risk of undermining your child's trust in you.
Whatever the child asks, make sure it's a factual answer, unless you don't know the answer, and then you say, that's a good question. I'm not sure of the answer. Let me find out, and then I will tell you, and then be sure you come back because the child is going to be waiting for that. If you don't really let the child know what's going on, the child loses their faith in you as an adult. Trust is broken. They don't feel as though they can depend upon you. And if I wasn't given correct answers about this, what else is there that I wasn't given the right answer to? So whatever you said loses its validity.
You need to provide security for that child, those children in the family, or that child, to know that they'll still be cared for and there's still going to be money for food and clothing. However, sometimes finances are, because dad's gone, finances are greatly affected. So we need to prepare children for changes, like maybe moving. Try to put it in such a positive light that you can, so that it looks like a new adventure that's fun, that you're all going to be experiencing together.
When talking to your children about their loved one's death, be sure to tell them a complete story. Otherwise, they may fill in the blanks with inaccurate information.
I worked with a couple of little boys who were brothers. Their father had died in a very devastating car accident. But the way they explained it was that their father ran the car off the road and drowned, which wasn't right at all. Yes, it was a car accident, but the mother had just told them he died in the car. So they filled in the blanks, and that's what children will do with illogical connections. They have to have the whole story, whether you're reading them a book, or whether you're telling them a story, or you're talking to them about how their mother died. They're going to fill in they're going to start with the beginning, the middle, and the end, whether you tell them the truth or they make it up, because they have to fill it in. They can't have parts of a story. If you have a difficult story to tell the child, you tell it in pieces with just enough at each part, and then you can go in and fill the details so they can handle more at a later time.
If you realize that you've given your children misinformation about their loved one's death, you need to be upfront with your children about this.
Okay, anytime a parent uses an explanation that is false, or it wasn't, the best language or whatnot, it's just like any other time that we make a mistake with our child. We let them know that what I said really wasn't true, and this is the truth. Or I didn't know that much, now I've learned more, and here's what I'd like to share with you.
Sometimes your children may be unwilling to talk about their grief. Again, Understand that children are often unwilling to talk to their parents about grief because their parents don't talk about it, or the children fear they're upsetting their parents when they talk. That said, there are many exercises you can do with your children to help them open up, like sentence completion and letting children express themselves through art.
When we use sentence completion with children, to them it's more like a game, and they really connect with that. And so you create different storylines that they could finish. Oh, we were standing outside and a hearse from the funeral home drove by. Somebody had died. Who do you think that person was? And they think and they talk, and you just go ahead and keep talking with them. And that way, it's like a window into what they're thinking and what they're feeling, but done in a non-obtrusive way. But if you go to a child and say, okay, now what are you thinking about this right now? What are you feeling about this? I don't know. I don't know. This way, you bypass all that.
It doesn't take an art therapist to do art therapy with a child. You're not going to interpret it. You're just going to let it be a mode of expression for them. So while you're talking to the child, to have them coloring a page, maybe saying, draw a picture of what you think it looks like when Daddy being in heaven now. And just then you can talk to them and explore their grief. They're listening to you, even though they're not looking at you, having eye contact, they're just drawing, but they're taking it in. That's just how children listen many times effectively. It needs to be a quiet environment, not the TV on, the radio blaring. And it's okay to have a group of kids around in a circle and do that together, maybe a couple of their friends, because that would be a good way for them, the friends, to learn how to comfort that child.
Other activities you can do to help your children are having them come up with a list of their deceased loved ones' favorite things, helping the children write an obituary from their perspective, or making a collage with pictures that represent the things the children remember about their loved one. Also, playing with the children is another way to help them open up.
If a child is depressed, chances are that the child isn't as verbal as usual. And because of that, to ask them about it, you're going to get a lot of I don't knows, things like that. And I'd approach it differently. I'd approach it with drawing. I'd approach it with playing with puppets. I'd approach it with writing stories, or having them finish stories. But something different, like we do a lot of play activities when you're working with children, because the way they open up is just so much better. And parents can do this. It doesn't take a therapist.
One other great way to help children express their feelings is to show them pictures of people expressing a wide variety of emotions. Let the children pick out which facial expression matches how they're feeling. Once they do, tell them what that emotion is and ask what made them pick that picture. Finally, help your children make a scrapbook to remember this lost loved one. It can include pictures of the loved one, lists of his or her favorite foods, TV shows, and places to go, personal items, and pictures your children draw of favorite times with their loved one. Also consider asking those who knew your loved one to write letters to the children telling them what kind of person their loved one was. Even if your children are too young to read the letters or appreciate all the items in it, down the road, they will thank you for this book. As much as you may want your children to talk, sometimes your children want to talk about their grief at the most inopportune times. Don't miss these chances to have meaningful dialogues about grief.
It's kind of Murphy's Law. When you're the busiest is when your kids need to talk. But you don't want to lose those moments. They're precious. And children need now. They grieve intermittently. They grieve intermittently. They grieve in spurts. So you want to capture that moment while that grief's bubbling to the surface.
You need to always be available for that teenager. Even though they don't want to talk to you, you need just to be as available as you can be. And just pray that the Lord gives you the wisdom to be aware of what might be going on, and He will give you that wisdom.
If your children have lost a close family member, it does more than make them sad. It affects their daily activities. This is why it's important to let your children understand how life will be different now that their loved one has died. But before explaining how things will be different, assess what the needs the deceased loved one met in your children's lives.
I think it's really important for parents to sit down with their children after the other parent dies, after they lose a spouse, and to say, help me understand, what things you're really concerned about that dad or mom, the person who died, did with and for you. And I'd like to see if we can't make those things still happen in some way. I know it won't be either dad or mom doing them, but if these things are really important to you, maybe we can have grandma or uncle help with that, or maybe that's something that I can do.
Even though your life will be different, your child needs to understand that you're still a family.
One of the things that's real important for a child is that they remember that we're still a family. It gives a sense of structure, which they need. They need a sense of security. They need a sense of sameness. Discuss, what do you think our family looks like? You might want children to draw what their family looks like and discuss that artwork. But each person needs to have some input on what they think their family looks like now and what the rules might be.
The loss of a loved one can throw a family into chaos. As soon as reasonably possible, establish or reestablish routines.
It's important to establish routines after the loss of a loved one because that brings a sense of security to the child's environment.
Something they can depend on. We get up at a certain time, we go to school, we're going to play at this time, we go here, we go there. And so if we can get them to go back to those routines, then that gives them a sense of security, the feeling that things are getting better, all is well. An example of that, one of the problems that occurred in Hurricane Katrina is that the children were displaced and they couldn't go back to their school, which was a real source of security. Well, they had the props taken out from underneath them because there was no place to return where everything was familiar. Teacher, my desk, my friends, recess, playground, all of that. It was no longer there. And so you need to look into the life of your child to find out, okay, what was my child's routine? How can I gently move them back to that?
When a family member dies, to help the family move forward, your child may need to take on extra responsibilities. As much as possible, make sure these new responsibilities are age appropriate.
When a child is in the midst of loss and they're grieving, just like an adult, they're not as functional. They're not as proficient as they used to be. So if we bring something new in that the child has never done before or is really difficult, then that undermines the child's sense of security or self-esteem. If they have something that they can just fit into and they can do it and feel good about it, that's comfortable for them. But you don't want to overload them at that time.
People said to Daniel after Brian died, now you're the man of the house, and it just drove me nuts because he's not. He's still 13, and that's what I want him to be. I don't want him to be the man of anything yet.
The best thing you can do for your children is to help them depend upon God during their grief. One way to do this is to pray with your children and to read the Bible with them.
Allow God to heal your family and lean hard on Him. Read Scripture together. The Psalms are very healing.
The Bible is a great resource for helping you comfort a grieving child. H. Norman Wright gives an example of how it can be used to help a child who has trouble sleeping.
Children struggle with their fears, and I think one of the times that they really get out of line, just like we as adults, is when you go to bed at night. And you allow your mind to start racing and you start thinking of the worst. And what is really important for a child is to realize that there's an answer to the fears and that their sleep can be calming. And this is why we would read a passage of Scripture like this to a child and share this with a child. In fact, some parents will go into their child and say, let's recite Proverbs 3 together. And they will go over it together and talk about, now this means that the Lord is with you when you're sleeping. And we look to Him to give us a calm night and a sleep that the Scripture says is sweet. And we'll just thank Him for that. It's really important when you're working with a child to go back to the Scriptures for many of your answers. This is a perfect teaching time for them to see how God's Word really fits in.
If you're wondering where you can find Scripture to share with your children, consider using your Grief Share workbook. It's filled with scriptures that you can read. Look through the From Mourning to Joy exercises to find verses and truths you can share with your children.
Children can make a God can that's simply a coffee can covered with paper, and can have someone write their fears, their worries, their anxieties, their guilt on a piece of paper, each individually, and then talk about it with the adult who's with them, and then have them symbolically place that in the God can. Because God cares for us, and we're told to cast all our cares on Him. That's important. And that's important for a child when working with fear.
As your child becomes more and more open about sharing his or her grief, you will hear things that will break your heart. But one thing that may really frighten you is learning that your child is contemplating suicide. If you suspect your child is suicidal, it's always best to err on the side of caution. Schedule an appointment with a professional counselor or pastor who is trained in suicide prevention. I stress consulting someone who is trained in suicide prevention because untrained pastors and counselors are often unsure of how to work with children contemplating suicide. So they may not be able to comprehend the child's thought process, and they want to tell your child, stop thinking that way, or get that thought out of your mind. When this happens, the door to any communication that could take place will be closed. So don't hesitate to ask those who are considering sending your child to if they have been trained in suicide prevention. One more thing, consult the professional you've scheduled a meeting with to determine the best way to tell your child about the appointment. We've shared a lot of information with you, and you may feel overwhelmed. Please don't. You and your children will make it through your grief. But doing it alone probably isn't a good idea. Get help. Enlist family and friends to give your children what you can't. Also, it's important to you to remember that your children will mimic the way you process your grief. That's why it's important that you respond in a healthy manner. GriefShare is a great way for you to learn how to find comfort and support you need to make it through your season of grief. If you'd like to find a group, talk to the person who showed you this video, or log on to www.griefshare.org and click on Find a Group. Thank you so much for taking time to watch this video. I pray that the Lord will guide you during this difficult time.